I'm John Emmerling, a long ago Sugarbush skier. Today is September 17th, 2011, and I am up in Fayston, Vermont, and here with a true Sugarbush legend. Now, if you skied Sugarbush, or even northern Vermont, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you know this man. This is the legendary Patrick Collins. And if you know him, you may have been at the bar at his lodge, the Windbeam, and it was 10 o'clock and he was telling stories, and it was 11 o'clock and he was telling stories, and it was 12 o'clock and he was telling stories. That was Pat. He's got great stories. So we have him here tonight, and we're going to ask him to tell a story, one of his famous stories. And if we get lucky, we may have him do a second story. And with no further ado, here is Patrick Collins.
Am I ready now?
Now, Pat, would you, there was a story you were mentioning before. What is it? And tell us about it.
Well, when I was in high school, my dream was to go to Brown University and become an engineer. And my father got quite ill, and he wouldn't let me apply to Brown University, but I did it on my own. I took the SATs and everything, and I secreted them, and I sent my application off to Brown. And when it came back, they accepted me, but my father was not working then, and he was a very proud man. So he wouldn't let me contact the university and say, I need financial aid, because he was too proud to think of that. And he just notified Brown that I wasn't going to be attending at this time. And about a month later, my father passed away. And I was still in high school, and I wanted to get an education. So I accepted a track scholarship to Seton Hall University. And the first day of school, the track coach takes me and he says, I'm not going to allow you to come to school without joining the ROTC, because I'm not going to pay for your education and then have you get drafted. So he marches me down, and I joined the ROTC. And I spent 4 years, I ran track and went to the ROTC. And when I graduated, I became a second lieutenant. And we were a military police detachment at Seton Hall. And the last thing I wanted to be was the military police. And because my father had passed away, I took a job at night for the phone company. I used to be a janitor, and I would shovel half a ton of coal every night before I'd leave. And so I spent 4 years with the phone company. So when I graduated and got commissioned, I notified the Army that I spent 4 years in the Bell system, and I wanted to transfer to the Signal Corps. And they instantly sent me to the Advanced Signal School down in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. And while I was there, every time a technical question would come up on carrier systems and everything, the officer would say, this is how we do such and such. And he says, is that right, Lieutenant Collins? I'd say, yes, the only thing I knew was mopping floors and stuff. But I graduated from the signal school, and we had an advisor. And the advisor was to tell us what our first and second choices of a duty station would be. And the only thing I wanted to do was go to Europe. And he told me that they hadn't sent a signal officer to Europe in 3 years. And he said, if I say Europe, I'm going to end up on a hilltop in Korea listening to the Chinese, and I said, I don't care. I'm going to go to Europe. And I told all the guys in the class with me, I'm going to Europe. And they all got their orders, and my orders don't come through. And when the orders would come through, they would come in a big brown envelope. And the orders for Korea were in this big brown envelope. And everybody could look into your mailbox because it would be an open, fenced-in thing, and everybody could see what kind of mail you got. And one day, about 10 days before we were to graduate, I still hadn't gotten any orders. Everybody else was fully assigned. And they all come in laughing their ass off, and they said, you got your orders, and you're going to Korea. I thought, oh, shit. They all followed me like the Pied Piper into the mail room, and I asked for my mail, and the brown envelope was a calendar from the New Jersey Bell telephone. And I got a phone call about 2 days later and verbally told me I'm being sent to Europe. And I was the first one.
Right.
And I was so naive. I was being assigned to the EUCOM, European Command. And I got out a map trying to find where EUCOM, Germany was. And when I was sent over there, I ended up in a signal construction battalion. And I was a second lieutenant, and the executive officer of the company was a black officer, the most inspirational person I've ever known in my life. His name was Emmett Page, and he was incredible. He had been a high school dropout. He'd gone to Korea. He'd got a Silver Star and a battlefield commission in Korea, and he was now a first lieutenant, and he was our executive officer, and he was my inspiration. He, in the middle of the winter, in 3 feet of snow, he wouldn't leave the tent till his boots looked like glass, and then he'd step into dirt and mud, and we became the closest possible friends. And he married and had a little daughter, and I was so enamored with them. And I'd write home to my mother telling them about this black officer. And back in the 50s, blacks and whites did not really mix.
Right.
There was, you were totally isolated. And he was the most inspirational person I'd ever known. And when I left Germany, he stayed in service, and he was, a couple of years later, I get a call from him. You all right?
We're going to run out of battery power here.
Okay.
Keep going.
Well,
wrap it up.
Yeah, he stayed in service, and he was then a captain, and he came to New Jersey, and he called my house. And at the time, he was aware of the fact of the black and the white thing. And instead of coming to my house, he just called, and my mother answered and took a message. And when I got home, she says, this captain in the Army called you. And she says, is that the black officer? And I said, yes. And she said, what are you going to do if he comes here? I said, I'm going to invite him to stay. She says, not in my house.
Oh.
And that shocked me.
Oh my gosh.
I spent the next year of my life telling my mother what a wonderful human being he was, and inspirational. And a year later, he's now a major, calls me again. He was giving a speech at some college, and my mother again says, is this the black officer? And I said, yes. And she said, I want you to invite he and his wife and his daughter to come and stay with us, which I thought was
That's nice.
a marvelous thing. And I lost track of him.
Did he come to stay with you?
No, but I lost track of him. And then 2 or 3 years ago, this is 40 years later, I had sort of followed him, and I knew he'd stayed in, and he was a major, and then he was a colonel. And the last I had heard, he had become a general. This was a black high school dropout, And I was down in Alexandria, Virginia, visiting a nephew of mine. And his cousin, who's a distant relative of mine, is a one-star general in the Army at the current time, and he had dinner with us. And I told him about this Emmett Page, and I said I would give anything if I could track him down and find out where he is. And I was pretty sure he was out of the Army by then, because it was a long, long time. And so I gave him all the information, and he leaves at midnight. Next morning, I'm leaving the apartment in Alexandria. 10 minutes before I leave, phone rings, and it's my buddy, General Randall, and he says, I found Emmett Page, your guy, and he's living 20 miles from here. And he's retired as a 3-star general in the United States Army. And I called him, and I hadn't talked to him in probably 20 or 30 years. And military, it's like Collins, Emmerling, you never use first names. And I call him up, and he answers the phone, and he says, Page. And I said, Collins. And he burst out laughing.
Oh, great.
And we talked, and I drove out, and I spent the day with he and his wife. And the daughter wasn't there, but a son who I hadn't known was there. And he was now on the board of directors at the University of Maryland and about 3 other major colleges. And he, at one point, was the highest-ranking black officer in the United States Army. And I go in his basement, and it's like a museum with all his mementos. And there's a picture of a very handsome black officer. And black officer signs the picture, and he says, you are my mentor, my inspiration, and my leader. And he says, I'll always look up to you. And it was Lieutenant Colonel Colin Powell.
Wow. How cool.
It was wonderful.
Oh, yeah. I just
Great
got chills.
story,
I just got chills.
Great story.
Yeah.
Now, Pat, that was, I hope we're still rolling here, that was 12 minutes. That's pretty short.
Yes.
Given, the repertoire of easily over 10,000 stories. So we're going to have to finish this another time. But in the meantime, we'll put this one up on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay.
He was
That's a great story.
a wonderful, wonderful man. And